Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of our witnesses. I think we've had at least 6 hearings on housing this Congress, including 2 just on private equity's minor role in housing. But there's been one topic, however, that's been a conspicuous omission. We've not had a single hearing on the government's role in driving up housing costs. In the last 16 months, this administration, with the cooperation of Democrats in Congress, have dropped hundreds of billions of dollars in helicopter money to stimulate an already strong economy. $80 billion went to rental assistance. That's $80 billion above all the ordinary spending in this space. Went to rental assistance, vouchers, and other housing subsidies. It comes to hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And despite record demand, the Fed continued to artificially hold down mortgage rates at near record lows. So just as this administration has given us the highest inflation in 40 years, it's also given us these astonishing increases in housing costs. House prices skyrocketed almost 17% in the last year, 17%, while rents jumped about 12%. Now, some of my colleagues seem to be willfully blind to government's role in driving this inflation. The problem is actually bigger than that. Across these 6 housing hearings that we've had, this committee has spent most of its time seemingly grasping for justifications to spend even more of taxpayer money and expand government's role further. Now, setting aside the question of whether the federal government should have a role in the housing market, we should at least ask ourselves, do we really need to spend even more taxpayer money on housing? I think a more skeptical framework should guide us in these hearings. Whether in housing or otherwise, we ought to ask ourselves, what exactly is the market failure that we're trying to correct? And we should ask whether taxpayers' already generous safety net is somehow still inadequate. And in answering these questions, we should bear in mind the risk that the government solution will be worse than the problem. The risk of government failure is particularly acute when it comes to housing. The number and cost of housing subsidies that are already existing boggles the mind. There is the mortgage interest deduction, capital gains exclusion on home sales, tax deduction on property taxes, VHA, VA, USDA, mortgage insurance, and Ginnie mortgage-backed securities guarantees, down payment assistance. There's the low-income housing tax credit program. Then there's also this overlapping array of HUD programs, including project-based rental assistance, tenant-based rental assistance, public housing, Section 202 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for persons with disabilities, Section 521 rural rental housing, CDBG, home block grants, homelessness assistance, and then we have the GSEs, which subsidize more than half of all single-family mortgage debt, and I've probably left out a few. But look, after 50 years, and many hundreds of billions, maybe well over $1 trillion in subsidies, there's been no meaningful change in home ownership rates. In 1970, the home ownership rate in America was 64%. Today, it's 65%. Black ownership levels are similar today to when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. These government policies spent an enormous amount of money, but they've mostly just made housing more expensive. The inference is inescapable. When it comes to housing, government has often been the problem, not the solution. Today, we're likely to hear that the government should further subsidize senior citizens' ability to age in place. Now, to the extent that seniors want to stay in their homes, it's certainly their right, and very understandably, that's a very strong preference for a lot of seniors. Completely understandable. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it often makes perfect sense for seniors to decide to maybe move out of a 3 or 4 bedroom, 2-story house where they raise their children. Many seniors downsize to apartments, to mother-in-law suites, or to smaller homes. And in many cases, the seniors had already built up significant home equity, and so by selling their house, they have new and sometimes very significant resources relative to all of their other resources that they can use for any purpose they see fit. So my point is that downsizing can be a good thing for the senior, but also beyond that, because when a senior chooses to downsize, a new home comes on the market. Maybe the buyer will be a young couple looking to start a family. And this turnover helps to match a scarce resource to its highest and best use. So we should just be careful about any government interventions that might offset this natural set of reasonable choices that are available to people. To reduce inflation and make housing more affordable, we ought to pursue reforms that will leverage the power of free enterprise, increase housing supply, and make markets more competitive. In January, the chairman reiterated the housing finance reform principles that he released in 2019. His principles overlap considerably with the reform principles that I've released. I hope to be able to work with the chairman to develop a bipartisan consensus on this critical issue. Meanwhile, I hope the administration will finally engage on housing reform. Treasury has still not met its obligation to deliver a reform plan to Congress, and it's now 6 months overdue. So instead of seeking out any excuse or pretext to regulate more and spend more, the administration should look to opportunities for bipartisan legislation like housing finance reform that relies on free enterprise, not government, to make housing more affordable for more Americans, including seniors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.